March 1945. In the heart of Germany, as the Allies stormed through the collapsing Reich, a small, quiet drama unfolded. In a field camp near the Rhine, a detachment of German female prisoners sat in the fading light of the day, their uniforms disheveled, their faces pale from the months of confinement. The war was coming to an end, and these women had been caught between two worlds: the wreckage of the Third Reich and the promise of freedom from their captors, the Americans. Yet, despite their release orders, despite being told they could go home, something extraordinary happened. They didn't leave. Under the towering gray sky, in the muddy confines of a temporary camp, U.S. Army officers had gathered their prisoners together. The official announcement was clear: you're free to go. You may return to your homes in Germany. But instead of the elation that accompanied freedom, there was only hesitation. The women, whose uniforms once marked them as enemies of the Allies, stood frozen. Some whispered to each other, eyes wide, uncertain of what lay beyond the wire that kept them confined. The gates of the camp were wide open. The trucks that would take them back to Germany waited. But none of them moved. For weeks, the German women had been prisoners of the victorious Allies. Nazi auxiliaries who had served behind radios, behind desks, in factories, and on the battlefield. They were part of a defeated army, part of a machine now shattered. The war had ended, but the trauma of it all had not. And so, as the officers stood waiting for the women to step beyond their fences, many of them simply refused to go. It was a situation no one had planned for. No manual, no military guide, and no strategy had ever accounted for prisoners who, when granted their release, chose to remain in captivity. But here they were, behind American lines, asking to stay behind bars. Why? The answer was far more complex than anyone expected. These women, raised under the harsh doctrines of the Nazi regime, had been trained for a singular purpose: to serve. For some, that service had meant working as clerks, phone operators, and secretaries for the German military. For others, it had meant serving in auxiliary roles, conducting logistics, operating radios, and doing the vital work that kept the war machine running smoothly. They had grown up under the shadow of an ideology that demanded loyalty, discipline, and absolute submission. Their identities had been built on the rhythm of obedience. The war, as they had been taught, was not just about victory. It was about their very reason for existence. And now, in the aftermath of defeat, they were faced with a new reality. They were free to go. Yet the structure that had defined their lives was gone. The war had obliterated their homes, shattered their families, and left them in a foreign land, uncertain of what awaited them beyond the camps. They had been trained to follow orders, not to make decisions. They had been part of a collective system, and that system was no more. What remained was not a world of certainty, but one of confusion, fear, and desolation. As the days passed, more and more women turned away from the gates. They refused to go home, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. They were terrified. For many, the outside world was not just foreign, it was dangerous. With no resources, no family to return to, and no country left to call home, the prospect of freedom was more terrifying than the captivity they had known. In their minds, freedom meant isolation. Freedom meant vulnerability. The Allies were as perplexed as they were sympathetic. American officials had been trained to believe in the power of liberation, that the end of the war would bring relief, peace, and a new beginning. Yet here they were, watching as these women, some barely out of their teens, clung to their captivity. In response, the Americans began offering the women options. They could stay in the camps, be processed, and be sent to displaced persons camps in neutral countries. But to the Germans, this offer seemed like a cruel twist of fate. They had been captives of the Reich, then of the Allies. And now they would be captives of their own lives, forced to confront the abyss of a broken world without any structure to guide them. But even within the confines of the camps, there was something they could hold on to: order. The simple, mechanical routine of the camp, the roll calls, the curfews, the duties, offered a framework for survival. This structure, in a world shattered by war, had become a lifeline. The Americans, witnessing the women's quiet resistance to freedom, began to understand the depth of their trauma. The reality of captivity, of constant subjugation, had ingrained a need for structure. Without it, they feared they would fall apart. They needed routine to function. They needed meaning. As the weeks turned into months, more and more women began to settle into the rhythm of camp life. They worked as assistants in medical wards, served meals in the mess halls, and even took on administrative duties, all while surrounded by their former captors. Some began to teach the American soldiers rudimentary German. Others began to organize recreational activities within the camp. It was in these small acts, teaching, working, knitting, playing, that they found some semblance of normalcy. Their lives, once centered around serving the war effort, had now shifted to serving the new order. The psychological toll of the war, however, was not so easily erased. As they continued their routines, many began to confront the emotional wounds they had carried for years. Memories of family lost, of homes destroyed, and of the men who had fought and died for a cause they had once believed in. These women had been part of a regime that had justified the darkest actions of the war, and now they were left with a profound sense of guilt. The voices of those they had served, the voices of command and obedience, had been silenced. And in the silence, they were forced to reckon with their own complicity for the women who had once believed in the righteousness of the Reich. Returning to the freedom they had once known was not just a choice. It was a journey into the unknown. They faced the possibility of being labeled as traitors by their fellow Germans, of being blamed for a defeat that had left their homeland in ruins. For them, captivity was no longer just a state of physical confinement. It had become a psychological refuge from the storm of guilt and shame. In one of the final reports from the American command, an officer wrote, "These women are not enemies. They are the lost generation, caught between two worlds, one they had fought for and one that no longer exists." It was a sentiment that would echo through history, as the women who had refused to leave the camps became an emblem of the moral complexities that lingered long after the war's official end. The decision to remain behind the wire would not only affect these women, it would shape the way Germany itself would rebuild in the years to come. The legacy of those who had chosen captivity would reverberate through the decades as a nation sought to reconcile the brutality of its past with the uncertain promise of a new future. But for now, as the gates of the camp stood open, these women chose not to leave. They chose survival. And in the world beyond, the new peace was anything but certain. But what happened when they finally crossed the gates? How did they face the world they had once known, and what legacy did their captivity leave behind in the shadow of Reconstruction? As the summer of 1945 drew to a close, the American officers continued to receive requests for the women's remaining prisoners to stay behind. Some reluctantly complied with the international mandate to repatriate the detainees, but it was clear that the decision to stay or leave was deeply personal for many. For the first time, the psychological impact of the war on the women was becoming undeniable. The women who had refused to leave were not merely trying to avoid the outside world. They were, in many ways, avoiding their past lives. The concept of home had become almost unrecognizable. The world they had left behind, Germany before its fall, was no more. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless, and millions more had died. In the years leading up to their capture, the women had been immersed in the war effort, working as part of the machine that fueled the Reich's aggression. Some had been conscripted into service as typists, telephone operators, or support staff for the military. Others had worked as nurses or in more administrative roles. All had served under the shadow of the Nazi regime's ideals, forced to abandon their own individualities and identities in favor of a collective goal. For some, the uncertainty of returning to this broken country was unbearable. Freedom, paradoxically, had become their greatest fear. For these women, the idea of walking back into a Germany in ruins, with its shattered homes and fractured families, was a prospect filled with terror. Without the security of the camps, they were afraid of being labeled traitors and of being blamed for the failure of the Reich. There was also the simple, heartbreaking reality: they had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. Many of them had lost loved ones to the war, to bombings, or to the atrocities that had unfolded across Europe. The enemy was no longer the soldier in the uniform of a different army. For them, it had become their own reflection, their own past. The prisoners' refusal to leave came to symbolize something deeper, an internal struggle for meaning, for identity, and for the ability to reconcile the past with the future. These women had been shaped by the totalitarian state that had demanded their allegiance, and now they faced the aftermath of its collapse. They were left in a state of limbo, not knowing who they were or where they belonged. The war had stolen their homeland, their purpose, and their families. And now, it seemed, it had stolen their freedom too. The American officers, caught between their duty and their understanding of the situation, began to shift their approach. They gave the women more time, allowing them to stay in the camps for weeks after the war's official end. They were given rations, medical care, and even the option to work. Some took up these offers, finding a sense of comfort in the familiarity of the camp structure. But as the months passed, more women began to leave. They left not out of a desire to return home, but because they were finally ready to face the world outside. It was a slow, painful process, with many lingering behind the wire for longer than anyone could have anticipated. For the women who finally walked out of the camp gates, the world that awaited them was unrecognizable. In the streets of post-war Germany, the remnants of their past still haunted them. The cities were still in ruins, their buildings scorched, their roads cracked. The scars of war were not just physical, they were emotional. The women who had once been part of the Nazi system now walked through a shattered country. Their former comrades now disbanded, their families scattered, their futures uncertain. Some of the women were met with hostility. They were called collaborators by their fellow Germans, and in many cases, they were shunned by their communities. The deep psychological and moral damage of the war had created a divide that could not be easily healed. Their refusal to leave the camps had become a symbol of the greater struggle that Germany itself faced, how to reconcile the actions of its past with the need to build a future. Yet, for others, the return to Germany became a necessary journey of self-discovery. Many found themselves rebuilding their lives in a country that was no longer the one they had known. They found work in reconstruction efforts, helping to rebuild the cities and the institutions that had once been a part of the regime they had served. Some began to question the values they had held during the war, while others tried to return to a semblance of normality. Eager to bury the trauma they had experienced, the U.S. Army itself struggled with the aftermath. How had the American military failed to understand the complexity of the prisoners' emotional state? How could they not have predicted the women's reluctance to leave? What seemed like an innocent offer of freedom had, in many cases, become a new form of captivity, a psychological prison built from the weight of guilt, fear, and a loss of identity. In the years that followed, the women who had chosen to stay in the camps became an emblem of the psychological costs of total war. Their stories were often lost in the broader narrative of the war's end, overshadowed by the focus on the political and military leaders who had shaped the outcome of the conflict. But for those who had survived the war's aftermath, their stories were a reminder of the deeper human toll, one that was not always captured in military reports or in post-war trials. As decades passed, the memory of these women faded. The world moved on, and Germany began to rebuild itself. But for those who had stayed behind the wire, their journey was not one of simple freedom. It was a painful, uncertain process of redefining themselves, of learning who they were outside of the uniform they had once worn. Some found peace in the years that followed, while others continued to wrestle with their past. But the legacy of their decision to remain when freedom was offered served as a haunting reminder of the complexities of war, of captivity, and of the human soul's struggle for meaning in the face of destruction. For the women who walked away from the camps and into a world they had never imagined, the future was no less uncertain than the war they had left behind. And in that uncertainty, they discovered a new truth, that freedom, like captivity, is not always a straightforward choice. It is a journey shaped by the forces of history, the weight of guilt, and the quest for survival. And for these women, that journey would define them for the rest of their lives. The question remains, when freedom is given, but the past lingers like a shadow, what price is paid for choosing to leave behind the shackles? And what does it mean to truly be free? As the years unfolded, Germany's recovery from the war became a testament to its ability to rebuild. The economic miracle of the 1950s transformed what had been a desolate, divided nation into a powerhouse of industry and innovation. Yet, even as the country surged forward, the women who had spent months, some years, within Allied camps found themselves stuck in a different kind of limbo. their personal histories wrapped in the lingering shadows of their past. For many of these women, the decision to refuse release from the camps had not simply been an instinct for survival, but a profound internal struggle. They had chosen captivity because it offered something their shattered homeland could not: structure, purpose, and safety. In the months following their return to Germany, they found themselves haunted by more than the destruction of their cities. They were haunted by the collapse of everything they had once known, not just geographically, but ideologically. The regimes and principles that had given meaning to their lives had crumbled, leaving them with a deep sense of uncertainty about their place in a new world. One of the most striking things about these women was their silence. In the years following the war, few of them spoke openly about their experiences in the camps. Some had internalized their trauma so deeply that they could not bring themselves to confront it. Others feared the judgment they would face from their fellow Germans, many of whom held them responsible for the horrors wrought by the Nazi regime. This silence, however, did not mean forgetfulness. Rather, it was a protective shield, one they had learned to build over years of repression and control. As Germany rebuilt itself, the country's focus shifted toward recovery, both politically and economically. The memory of the war, of those who had served the Reich, was pushed to the background. National discourse centered on the creation of a new identity, one rooted in democracy and peace. But for the women who had once been part of the Nazi war machine, their role in this narrative was uncomfortable, to say the least. They had been part of the machinery that had sustained the war effort. And now, in the face of defeat and denazification, they struggled to find their place in a new Germany that demanded accountability for the past. In the early 1950s, many of these women were still living with the consequences of their wartime roles. Some found work in post-war administrative positions, utilizing the skills they had acquired during their time in the military. Their technical expertise in areas like logistics, translation, and communications became invaluable in the rebuilding process. However, their past remained a shadow that they could not escape. They were part of a generation that had been immersed in a totalitarian ideology, and now, in the aftermath of war, they had to reckon with the complexity of their participation in the absence of formal recognition or acknowledgement of their trauma. Many of these women turned inward. Some found solace in their families, their children, and their new roles as wives and mothers. But even within the privacy of their homes, the emotional scars of the war remained, unspoken but ever present. They were a generation marked by the war, not only because of what they had endured as prisoners, but also because of what they had once believed in and now had to reconcile with. A significant number of these women were unable to fully reintegrate into civilian life. The societal stigma associated with their involvement in the war effort made it difficult for them to find peace. They had been part of a regime that was synonymous with evil, and even though they had not actively participated in its atrocities, their association with it was inescapable. The psychological burden of being labeled a collaborator or enemy was compounded by the guilt they felt over the destruction they had witnessed. By the late 1950s, some of the women began to speak out. In interviews and letters, they described their experiences in the camps and the difficulty of living in a post-war society that demanded they forget their past. They recounted the choices they had made, the decision to stay behind the wire, the hesitation to return to a Germany that no longer existed. Their stories, however, were often dismissed as the ramblings of those trying to justify their actions. The broader German public, still recovering from the war's devastation, had little patience for those who had been part of the old regime. Even in its periphery, one of the most poignant aspects of their post-war existence was the contrast between their personal struggles and the rapid transformation of Germany as a whole. While the country moved quickly toward reconstruction and prosperity, these women were left behind, still grappling with the emotional and moral consequences of their wartime roles. The economic miracle that swept through West Germany did little to alleviate their internal turmoil. They were survivors of a different kind of war, one that was not fought with weapons, but with ideology, conformity, and the loss of identity. In the decades that followed, many of the women who had been imprisoned in Allied camps found themselves as a forgotten generation, their experiences overshadowed by the broader narrative of victory and defeat. They were neither celebrated as war heroes nor condemned as war criminals. They were simply survivors, left to navigate a post-war world that had no place for them. Their stories, once relegated to the margins of history, would eventually be revisited, though not until the 1980s and 1990s, when historians began to explore the psychological effects of war captivity on those who had been on the periphery of the conflict as the years passed. The women who had once refused to leave the camps began to pass away, their stories fading into obscurity. Yet, their legacy remains. They were not simply passive victims of the war. They were participants in a world that demanded obedience, structure, and sacrifice. Their decision to stay behind the wire was not just an act of defiance, but an act of survival. It was a choice to cling to the only life they knew in the face of a world that had been torn apart. The silence that enveloped them for so many years was not just the silence of their own minds, but the silence of a society that was not ready to hear their stories. But in their quiet resistance, they had learned a hard truth, that in the aftermath of war, it is not just the physical destruction that endures, it is the emotional and psychological scars that shape the course of history. These women, in their refusal to leave, had shown that captivity could be more than just a physical state. It could become a psychological refuge, one that held them long after the war was over. And in that silent refuge, they found a strange and painful solace. Their story was not one of victory or defeat. It was a story of survival, of identity, and of the psychological cost of war. And in the decades that followed, the memory of their refusal to leave would become a symbol of the deeper, often unspoken, impact of war, a reminder that the consequences of conflict are not always measured in bodies or battles, but in the souls of those who live to witness the aftermath. In the end, the true cost of war is not counted in what is lost on the battlefield, but in what lingers in the silence after the guns have fallen quiet.